3 months, the whole deal can blow up. If there's a dispute and it doesn't get resolved in 3 months, then basically, the other party can just walk away from the agreement and the agreement is dead. If you get an additional $100 billion in purchases, that can add roughly 50 basis points of growth each year for the next 2 years. That is considered bazonga's growth. The party shall eliminate any requirement that the holder of a trade secret establish actual losses as a prerequisite to initiation of a criminal investigation. This is the money line. This is the big money line. Today, we're going to jump right into something that many people don't understand, and the ins and outs of the US-China trade deal. So we're actually going to go into the actual document, and I'm going to shorten it. Don't worry, it's 90 plus pages long. And we're going to look at a few key aspects of it. So before we go into some of the key sections, everyone talks about the $200 billion that was agreed to buy additional goods from the United States. So that's kind of actually all the way down at the bottom of this thing. So it's kind of straightforward. They kind of just say, hey, you need to increase your purchases by a certain amount over the baseline set in 2017. It's down on page 55. And they break out manufactured goods, agriculture, energy, and services. And then they put basically the increases for each of those categories. You can see here year 1 and year 2, and you add it up, and it's $200 billion on the dot. And then they actually go and specify, here are all of the different classes and types of products that you can buy for these different categories. So it's pretty specific, right? Now, why does this matter and what kind of impact does this have? So it just came out that our Q4 GDP grew at 2.1%, and it was expected it was going to grow at 2%. So a small beat, right? But still only around 2%. So we've got roughly a $20 trillion economy. So when you do the math and you say, okay, so if you're growing at 2% a year, let's just annualize it, right? So if you're growing at 2% a year, how much is that? That's $400 billion. So if you're doing $20 trillion in GDP, that means the next year you should be doing $20,400 billion in GDP. That's a 2% annualized growth, right? So if you get an additional $100 billion in purchases from China, then that means if you were growing at $20,400 billion, you now are at $20,500 billion. And so if you were at 2% growth, you're now at 2.5% growth. So in other words, that can add roughly 50 basis points of growth each year for the next 2 years. Considering that if the US economy grows at 3% annualized GDP growth, that is considered bazonga's growth. Like really aggressive, unbelievable, unprecedented, oh my God, I cannot believe we're growing at 3% kind of growth. So if 2% is kind of what we're doing, and then you get another 50 basis points, you kind of just like cut the delta in half. So $200 billion. Now, the reason why it directly adds back to GDP growth is the way that GDP is calculated. We've covered the calculation before on the show, but basically, you're looking at the production of the United States and the investment that's going in or out of the United States. And the last item of the equation is tallying up net imports versus exports. When you have more exports than imports, that's a positive trade balance. That number gets added to the GDP. We are a net importer by far. Hundreds of billions of dollars in trade deficit just with China and just with Germany. We've got a lot of trade deficits. That means we import way more than we export to these countries. So if you can now, and then that number, that net import number gets subtracted from our overall GDP growth. So it literally is directly contributing to slower growth that's just the math. So if you can now take away $100 billion, which essentially gets added back to growth, to GDP growth, well, okay, that gives you 50 basis points. So it's a pretty big deal. And so that's just point one. That's I feel like that's just about anyone has really talked about when it comes to US-China trade deal. Now let's actually look at the meat of this thing. That's just the one section. I don't know. And most of this section is just these little charts showing what industries you can buy stuff from. But this actual section where you say you got to buy $200 billion worth of stuff is like 5 pages long. It's a 91-page document. So there's actually a lot of other stuff in here, which is pretty important. So let's scroll all the way back up and look at that stuff. Okay. And I would say IP infringement is probably one of the big kahunas in this thing. And it actually dovetails exactly with a lot of the things that we talk about on the show. So literally it's page 2. It's intellectual property. This is the top of the agreement. We were all the way down at the bottom. So what this talks about is trade secrets. So basically this says the US likes trade secret protection and China needs to optimize their business environment to make it a core element of their business environment. And, you kind of see the same pattern in a lot of these sections, right? This is kind of the preamble, this section 1.3. And then this is the scope. And so, this is what both parties do. And then it lists out what China has to do and then what the US has to do. Here's what China has to do. So they're going to add to their laws what accounts for trade secret misappropriation. That basically means stealing trade secrets. Electronic intrusions, aka hacking, breach or inducement of a breach of duty not to disclose information that is secret. I think this is like human sources of hacking, unauthorized disclosure or use of the acquisition. Basically, all the mechanisms that you're going to use to get someone's IP. And so China needs to do some updating, and then it basically says that the US doesn't need to change anything because the US is all set on this. So you basically see that happening many times over. Here is the big deal with the IP stuff. Burden shifting in a civil proceeding. So the party shall provide that the burden of production of evidence or burden of proof as appropriate shifts to the accused party in a civil judicial proceeding for trade secret misappropriation where the holder of a trade secret has produced appropriate evidence, including circumstantial evidence and yada, yada, yada. It goes on to say what kind of evidence can be produced. So by the party that's harmed, right? So if you took my IP, here's what I need to do to establish that. Evidence that the accused party, so this would be the party, government, or company that is now taking your trade secret, had access or the opportunity to obtain the trade secret and the information used by the accused party is materially the same as that trade secret, right? So, hey, these people were able to get access to it either, through one of those mechanisms previously described, and we can see them now benefiting from this because now they're using it, or they just rolled out a new product and it looks basically the same as the thing I have. And evidence that a trade secret has been or risks being disclosed or used by a third party. So, hey, look, there's evidence of hacking here. And other evidence that, could be supporting that conclusion. So here, under the circumstance that the right holder provides preliminary evidence that measures were taken to keep the claimed trade secret confidential. So if you took my stuff and I can show, hey, I had protections around this, right? I wasn't just kind of waving it around in the air for anyone to come take. I put meaningful systems in place, mechanisms to keep this stuff confidential. The burden of proof or burden of production of evidence as appropriate
shifts to the accused party. Okay, that's the key thing here. And then it also says, the US is good, we don't need to do anything. Okay. I get a kick out of that line every time. Now, here's why this is such a big deal. And they come back to this multiple times. Criminal enforcement. What's the threshold for criminal enforcement? The party shall eliminate any requirement that the holder of a trade secret establish actual losses as a prerequisite to initiation of a criminal investigation. This is the money line. This is the big money line. Then they talk about what China needs to do to increase the penalties, the criminal penalties that you can prescribe to someone that has now broken these trade secret laws. Okay, let me switch and come back to this and explain why that's such a big deal. So, establishing actual losses is not an easy thing to do. So, this is a big time law firm, and here's an article that they have about calculating monetary damages in trade secret cases. So this concept of actual loss, it's a legal term, and it's actually very arduous and very expensive and very difficult to establish actual losses, right? So basically it says that at least 50% and possibly as much as 85% of the value of American companies is attributable to intangible assets. It could be trade secrets. That this report states that intellectual property theft is the second most common fraud in China. Okay, this wasn't like a Chinese article. It just says, hey, this stuff happens all the time in China. Such trade secret or confidential information losses have enormous impact on the individual holders of these property rights. Often a company will need to resort to the bet the company litigation to assert their rights to their property. Basically, what this stuff goes on to describe is how difficult it is to establish actual losses for these kinds of things. And here's another article which talks about it in a little bit more plain English. Without a doubt, the burden of action falls mostly on the Chinese side. This agreement also eliminates any requirement that the holder of a trade secret establish actual losses as a prerequisite. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And it speeds up the criminal proceeding for intellectual. These changes are a tremendous relief for American businesses because they are the ones currently bearing the burden of proof for any trade secret misappropriation and are required to establish an actual loss in order to get criminal proceedings going. Numerous American businesses handle their losses resulting from intellectual property theft quietly because bearing the burden of proof and establishing actual loss are both a costly and time-consuming endeavor. So they do it quietly. Also saying, hey, we don't want to admit to the world, and our shareholders, that we just got hacked and we lost all this value, or to our competitors. So basically, if you want to start criminal proceedings in China, you now need to make a statement that says, hey, we just lost $1 billion worth of value because they hacked us. And you don't know if you're even going to win. And you got to pay a bunch of money to go and establish the actual loss. And you got to get lawyers involved. And it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. So all of that is now gone. All of that's gone. Now what you do is you say, hey, we have sufficient evidence to prove that we were trying to protect this stuff. I've got evidence here, here, and here that someone hacked it or paid someone off or bribed someone or whatever mechanism they used to acquire this illegally. And look, we can see that they're now deploying it and using it, in their facility or to their benefit. So now China needs to ramp up the penalties on this. That's what this section 1.7 talks about. And it lays out, how then criminal proceedings can be taken and the reciprocity from, US and China and these kinds of things. It talks about what the role of the government has to do. And then it talks about how this relates to specifically to the pharmaceutical industry, different than, say, the tech industry. So that's a big deal in terms of helping US companies protect their trade secrets. It has fundamentally changed the process to be able to start these actual proceedings and see them through. Now, if they aren't seen through properly, or the US feels like the that the Chinese courts or whoever it may be are not acting in good faith, then there is an escalation option at the bottom of this agreement, which I'm going to get to in a second. So this is a big deal on the IP front. The other part of this is around, let me scroll down. So then it talks about patents. It talks about, counterfeit products. We actually just covered this yesterday on the show when we were talking about what the Trump administration is putting forward to hold US marketplaces like Amazon more accountable for counterfeit products. What this is saying here, this isn't a trade secret violation, but what this is saying is, let's say you're a US product manufacturer and there's counterfeit products being sold on e-commerce platforms in China. Now it's setting out a mechanism for these things to be taken down, require expeditious takedowns, and go into all of this, right? And then it says that the US is good. They don't need to do anything. Their online environment's fine. What's funny is the US is actually changing that stuff now, but they didn't agree to it in this agreement. Infringement on major e-commerce platforms. China shall provide that e-commerce platforms may have their operating licenses revoked for repeated failures to curb the sale of counterfeit or pirated goods. I mean, this is a big deal. If you're a luxury good manufacturer, and the interesting thing about this is you don't really hear, for example, the French LVMH luxury good manufacturers. I mean, behind closed doors, I guarantee you they are rejoicing over these provisions because you want to go buy a Louis bag on Alibaba or JD.com. What, do they it's like they can't even hold a flame to have any influence to actually get these things taken down. We've talked about this being an issue with Amazon in the United States. Amazon policing those counterfeits is probably 1/100th of the difficulty of getting the Chinese e-commerce platforms to police Louis bags. It's just not going to happen. So now there's provisions for that as well. It goes on to talk about copyright and trademark. And then Section G is talking about exporting pirated and counterfeit goods to the United States. So now this is in the other direction, right? So how are counterfeit products being sold in China? And then what kind of counterfeit products are being made in China and then exported? And it covers medicines here and things with health and safety risks. So this is actually interesting because one of the reasons that I think Chewy, not a platform company, I remember, was it Petco? I think Petco bought Chewy and then has now spun it off. And Chewy is an online linear e-commerce store for pet products. It's not a platform. They are all buying and reselling. And one of the reasons why they say, and their differentiator is around quality. And so what they're saying is, hey, what happens if you buy these products on Amazon? My puppy eats Stella and Chewy. This stuff is super expensive, but apparently Stella and Chewy does not sell this stuff on Amazon. So I'll go into a pet store, we'll buy Stella and Chewy, or we buy it on Chewy. No, there's no affiliation between those two companies. And the pet store says, do not buy Stella and Chewy on Amazon because it's all kind of third-party product that has been put up on there. It might be stale, it might be old. There could be something wrong with it, right? And so that's the same argument that Chewy has, which is the food is now procured properly from the manufacturer or an authorized distributor, A. And B, what happens if you get your pet a toy and, that toy is not pet safe? My dog will chew through that thing in about 30 minutes, and then he starts to eat the thing. And so if it's not built with quality stuff, he might be in trouble, right? That might risk his safety. So you don't want that. That's the whole premise for why Chewy is linear and why I think they've actually been able to carve out a nice niche away from Amazon because they are instilling fear, somewhat probably rightfully so, in consumers to say the Amazon quality is not there that you're going to get with the linear experience on Chewy. So So that's this counterfeit medicine provision. That's this counterfeit goods with health and safety risks. That would absolutely be bundled into this Article 1.19. They go into now trademarks and these kinds of things. Judgment. There's other stuff in here too. Okay. Technology transfer. Okay. This is what you hear a lot about is forced technology transfer. So you're saying, hey, I'm a tech company. I want to go do business in China. China says, great, but you got to give me access to your technology. So now this puts in protections to say that a party shall have effective access to and be able to operate openly and freely in the jurisdiction of the other party without any force or pressure from the other party to transfer their technology to persons of the other party. Lots of other parties in that. Basically, it means you want to go do business in China, they can't force you to give them your IP. It must be, and any transfer must be based on market terms that are voluntary and reflect mutual agreement. And so it goes deeper into this, how to protect this and put some structure around it, and so on and so forth. So, okay. And then we start getting into trade and some agriculture things, agriculture protections and requirements. And okay, let's go all the way down to the teeth. This is in the 80s now. Okay, so this says, let's say someone violates this agreement. Considering that the US basically in every provision said, we're good, we don't have to do anything, I think there's only one party that might actually be violating this thing. And that's China. So it has now a dispute resolution timeline. This is a key thing to look at. First thing is 21 days. Then the next thing is 45 calendar days. At first I was reading this and I was like, oh, okay, that's 3 weeks. No. These are calendar days, not business days. So this is 3 weeks. And then this is 6.5 weeks. And then it's a month. So in 3 months, the whole deal can blow up. If there's a dispute and it doesn't get resolved in 3 months, then basically, the other party can just walk away from the agreement and the agreement is dead. Now, before you get to that point, let's say you go through this dispute resolution process and, the US says, hey, you took this company's stuff and you are not acting in good faith to make this company whole. You're not holding the accused party accountable, or let's say you're not buying the agriculture goods, or you're not buying you're supposed to buy $100 billion of stuff. You bought $50 billion of stuff. Basically, within this whole thing, if the parties do not reach consensus on a response, the complaining party may resort to taking action based on facts provided during the consultations. That's the dispute resolution, including by suspending an obligation under this agreement or by adopting a remedial measure in a proportionate way that it considers appropriate with the purpose of preventing the escalation of the situation and maintaining the normal bilateral trade relationship. That basically means #tariffs. And we're going to wield the hammer and put sanctions or whatever the US decides as a penalty on the accused party, or the party complained against is what they call it. And the US basically has the unilateral ability to keep the trade agreement in place, to say, hey, you're not acting in good faith to enforce this. We are going to take our own separate action, or whatever they call it here, remedial measure, to make sure that we are made whole. And then it gives them the ability to keep the agreement in place. If the party complained against, so let's just say that's China, considers that the action by the complaining party pursuant to this subparagraph was taken in good faith. This gives them the out. This gives China the out to say, if they think that the US acted in good faith by putting tariffs back onto their stuff because this agreement wasn't lived up to properly, the party complaining against, China, may not adopt a counter response or otherwise challenge such action. So this means that if we acted in good faith, this agreement wasn't being upheld, we being the US, we put tariffs back on you. You, China, can't counter that response and then put tariffs on our stuff, and then we're back into the trade war, right? If the party complained against considers that the action of the complaining party was taken in bad faith, the remedy is to withdraw from the agreement and blow up the agreement. And then we are back to square one, which they could do. But again, China does not want the trade wars to come back. And I think especially with the other health-related things going on in China, they need the economy to be in as good as a place as it can be. And I hope all those other things get figured out as soon as possible and all action is taken. And everyone kind of can hopefully come out of this as best they can. But that said, I think pretty clearly you can see where the leverage stands. You can all read this agreement yourself. But in the sense that who's going to be violating this thing, there's almost nothing here for the US to violate. It's really just if China's going to violate these actions or not live up to them. And then the US can bring back the pressure. And then China gets to decide if they're going to take this back to the brink and blow up the whole agreement and we're back to square one. I don't think they're going to do that, though. But this gives the mechanism for the governments to decide if maybe, say, the rest of the country, because President Xi has a lot of power, but they are changing laws. They need other courts to play ball with this. There's a lot of moving parts for this thing to come about. Do they actually buy $100 billion worth of stuff? There's a lot of moving parts to this. So it may not all be executed upon properly. But that allows the Chinese government to basically help make this thing whole, or the US government to do that. And then the Chinese government say, you know what? You're actually right. For whatever reason, this didn't work out the way it was supposed to. And we're not going to take a counteraction. Well, actually, they can't take any counteraction. They can't raise tariffs because we put on tariffs. They can only decide to blow up the deal, which is a pretty big decision. So they have to be pretty grumpy with whatever the US did, right? There's no kind of intermediate like tit for tat. The tit for tat is gone. It's either we'll take the blow. I think you're right, US. Or no, we're done with this and blow the whole thing up. It's against the extreme. So that's pretty interesting the way they structure this. Hi, this is Alex from Winner Take All. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the content. Feel free to leave a comment, ask us questions, and definitely make sure to join us on our next live stream.